Welcome everybody to the RCY webinar on Skye's Legacy, a focus on belonging, our latest report from the Office of the Representative for Children and Youth. My name is Jeff Rudd. You can't see me on your screen, but I'm the Communications Director at RCY, and thanks for joining our webinar. This is our first go-around with a webinar format on Zoom, so please bear with us if we have any technical difficulties. I think we'll learn quite quickly, but so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Representative Jennifer Charlesworth, who will be leading the webinar. And just before we get started, I'd just like to say we've left a few spaces in the presentation for questions. You can use the question and answer format that is at the bottom of the screen to type your questions in if you'd like to identify who you are or what your connection is to the report. That would be great. And I will read the questions, curate them, read them out loud to Jennifer during selected breaks where we've designated space to answer questions, and we'll also do some at the end as well. So we'll try to answer everybody's question. So I think that's about all I need to do in terms of taking care of business. So Jennifer, if you'd like to go.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And welcome everyone. As Jeff said, this is the first time we've done a webinar in this way to introduce one of our reports. And it feels particularly fitting to be doing it for Skye's Legacy. As you'll hear and understand as we go through, this is a report that's near and dear to my heart and to all of us in the RCY that have been involved. So I'd like to begin in a good way by welcoming you to this event, and also to acknowledge the territory that I am on today. I'm joining you from the traditional and unceded territory of Saanich people in the area that is also known by its colonial name as Saanich, and really grateful to be able to be held by these lands to do the important and sacred work that we do on behalf of children, youth, and families in the RCY. I'd also like to introduce you to colleagues of mine who will be here to help answer questions. And I also want to lift my hands up to them for the work that they've done. Caitlin Alder was one of the investigators responsible for Skye's Legacy report. So Caitlin is joining us. April Fox is the Acting Executive Director for Reviews and Investigations. She was very involved in the latter stages of this report. Jeff Rudd, whom you've met, and then colleagues Carissa Matheson and Sylvia Curry providing executive admin support. So that's the team for today. And as Jeff mentioned, we've left some pauses in this presentation, so we'll have an opportunity then for questions, and certainly welcome your feedback. And I think if I've got one key desire for us today is that you leave this taking a pause to reflect upon your influence and your practice, and what are the ways in which we can enhance the experience of belonging and connection for the young people that are in our circles that we care for and care about. Whether we're working directly with them or whether we're creating supporting programs and staff that are providing support to young people. So let's begin then. I'm going to share my screen, and by the way, please feel free in the chat to acknowledge where you're joining us from today, whose territories you are on. It's always helpful to take a breath and reflect on whose lands we are coming together on. So okay, so here we go. I'm just acknowledging the territory. And so Skye. So one of the things that I would like to do as a way to begin is invite you to understand who Skye is. So Skye, and Skye and her mom actually. And there are a few slides that I want to share with you, and a few little stories and anecdotes to give you a sense of who she was. So as a young child, Skye was cheeky and mischievous with a great sense of humor and an infectious laugh. She had a zest for life. She had a bubbly energy, and people talked about when she entered into a room, her spirit and her energy infused the room, and you couldn't help but notice her. She was a young person who needed to be busy, and when she was able to channel her energy, through activities. She loved rock climbing, swimming, horseback riding, and it was important for her to be in nature and to be able to be active. In fact, she loved going riding horses. She loved to fish. In fact, one person described fishing as her zen. And she was incredibly wise and articulate and inquisitive. And she would state her opinions. You knew where she stood. And in her own words, she said, "I'm a wise person, an owl." She was the kind of person who also stood up for her friends. So also to talk about her mom, because we can't understand Skye if we don't understand her mom and in fact her grandmother and the history of their family. So Skye's mom was a talented artist whose work appears on the inside and the back covers of our report. And she was described as creating beautiful quilts, painting beadwork and medicine bags. And in fact, when some of our staff were learning more about Skye's mom and visiting with people, they shared some of her art with us. So we've been very fortunate to get a glimpse of this beautiful person through her artwork. She was also described by people who knew her well as a smart, articulate woman with an awesome sense of humor. And she was generous and had many friends who loved her. And so it was evident to us throughout this investigation that Skye's mother wanted the best for her daughter. That's Skye and her mom there when she was an infant, and that they loved each other. They both wanted to be together and connected, although it became very complicated and complex as time went on. So I just wanted to start there by situating and centering Skye and her family for you. So we receive hundreds of reports each month of injuries and deaths of children in care and those receiving reviewable services. So that's part of our mandate under the Representative for Children and Youth Act. So when we are trying to determine what cases we will go to full investigation on, we ask ourselves a number of important questions. Is this story a shared story? So is this child's story one that we see in many other children's stories? In other words, it's not an outlier, it's something that is familiar to us. Can we make a unique contribution to enhance the awareness, understanding, and action related to this story and by telling this story? Can the lessons that we learn through this help improve the services and supports for young people and their families? And another question we ask is, can we tell the story in a respectful and thoughtful way? We don't want to cause harm through telling our story, cause harm to the families, cause harm to the people who love and supported that young person, or indeed to those who provided services and supports. We're not about causing harm, we're about creating change. So it was very important for our team to tell Skye's story in a good way. So the investigation team that researched and wrote this report was led by First Nations and Métis RCY staff members, and the research methodology used by the team was significantly influenced by an Indigenous worldview, in which it's understood that there are multiple stories and perspectives and truths that are relevant to any situation being considered. We all see it from a unique perspective. And these diverse stories and perspectives contributed to a more fulsome and holistic understanding of Skye, her family, the people connected to her, and the situations that they all faced and what they were trying to deal with. So just because I think it's important that we understand an Indigenous worldview is circular, and it understands that things are connected and interconnected. And from our view, that helps us make sense of complex situations. We value the circularity as opposed to the linearity, because nothing in the work that we all do, as you well know, is just simple. It's all complicated and complex. So in terms of what we did, we included an examination of all reviewable service streams within BC that had an involvement with Skye from 2002 to 2017. So the period from before she was in care and subsequent to her time being in care. So that included the family supports, it included mental health, it included child welfare services, child protection services. So there were a whole range of service streams that we took a look at. And we also reviewed records, policies, and data from MCFD, from the Coroner's Service, from PGT, Provincial Public Guardian and Trustee, and various community service agencies and schools that Skye was connected to. And I should just note quickly that Skye was never served by a delegated Aboriginal agency, despite the fact that she is a First Nations woman. So we did not inquire into the DA practices for this investigation. However, it's our hope, so those of you who are joining from the DAAs, thank you for being here. It's our hope that the learning from Skye's story will be of value to all the DAAs, and indeed we've already met with practice leads from the DAAs, so grateful for their continued interest. And I think, frankly, this is not just an MCFD related report, it's something that teaches us for education, for the school districts, for community service organizations, for healthcare, etc. So in terms of our methodology, again, we conducted 26 interviews that included foster caregivers, community service providers, MCFD staff, and key informants, including family members. In other ways, so that's quite typical, those are the things that we do, but in other ways, our investigation broke new ground. And so we used a much more relational approach than we have done in the past with respect to our interviews, and we used these, they were a storytelling approach. So trying to invite people into telling us their reflections and their stories, the kinds of anecdotes that they had of their time, of the struggles that they experienced. So we really wanted to understand what is the nature of the relationship that you've had, and what would you like to tell us that would help us understand Skye's story. We also brought together the qualitative and the quantitative. So we have a lot of data, we have a lot of information that teaches us about the trends and the patterns, and we wanted to weave those together. And as I've said before, Indigenous knowledge was woven into the investigation. And we also felt it was very important to situate this, not only Skye's story in the context of her family, but her family's story in the context of historical and intergenerational trauma. And the beautiful thing was that Skye's story began to tell itself, and the things that we needed to pay attention to, we just needed to listen and learn through story, and it was revealed to us where we needed to put our energy. We also went to a circle of advisors that we wanted to validate, we wanted to share what we were learning and validate and get their perspective. And these were people who were well steeped in Indigenous approaches, have been working in the area of Indigenous child welfare for many, many years, and doing research and writing and teaching and practice in this area. And they affirmed the direction that we were taking that was being revealed through Skye's story. We could have gone in a number of different directions, and in fact, I think I counted at one point we had 32 or 35 possible recommendations, but we wanted to keep the focus on what Skye's story teaches us particularly well, and what we think will make a difference to children, youth, and families going forward. And the circle of advisors really helped us in that regard. So I want to speak to the context that Skye's story comes in, and when we were contemplating release, it had just been at the time that the Tecumseh Tshwetmik reveal. This is actually when Samantha Cocker, Deputy Representative, and I were on a walk between Kamloops and Adams Lake in bringing the spirits home. And so we released this report during a period of significant trauma and grief for Indigenous peoples in BC and Canada. And in fact, that continues today with the revealing and the recovery and discoveries. So our release on June 10th came less than 2 weeks after the discovery of the 215 lost children on the former site of the Kamloops Indian Residential School. And we debated about whether it was appropriate to bring out our report at that very heavy and difficult time. And again, we don't want to cause harm, but we decided to consult with First Nation leadership, community members, and Chief Wanda Pascal, who's from Skye's Tetlagwichan Band in the Northwest Territories, and after consulting with them, we felt that it was important to forge ahead with it. And in fact, they said very clearly, Skye's story lifts up and reinforces all that has been coming to light since that discovery in Tk'emlúps te Secwépemc, and the more recent discovery by Cowessess First Nations in Saskatchewan, in fact. And it reinforces, and this is what we were told, it reinforces everything that the elders, matriarchs, leaders, survivors, and family members have told us, that the impact of settler colonialism and assimilation and elimination practices such as the Indian residential school, the 60s scoop, the Millennium scoop, that continues to affect the well-being of Indigenous children, youth, and families. So that was the context, and that was the deliberations that we went through and the deliberate intentions to enhance understanding so that we can enhance well-being. So I'll come to questions in just a moment, but why did we investigate Skye's story? And it really was because of that connection. And we try not to address outlier cases, and Skye's story was definitely not an outlier case. While her story is uniquely hers, and we are trying to tell that in a good way, but we see these kinds of issues arising, the kinds of things that Skye experienced and her mom and her grandmother experienced in their lives over and over again in our day-to-day advocacy and investigations work. So while much has changed in the Ministry of Children and Family Development's practice, policy, and legislation over the past 20 years since Skye was born, and in the year 2000, and there are many positive changes underway, we wanted to be aware of, we are aware of and involved in situations similar to Skye's, and we felt that it was important for us to bring her story forward so that we can bring a spotlight to the young people's experiences of a lack of connection and belonging to people, place, culture, and a positive sense of themselves. And without that, young people experience, and we see through our advocacy and reviews, much pain, sadness, distress, risks, and ultimately poor life outcomes. So we continue to see, despite the improvements and the changes over the last number of years, situations in which children are disconnected from their families and communities of origin due to what's often presented or perceived as a problem with the parent, particularly if they are experiencing substance use or mental health challenges, rather than seeing the parents or family members' vulnerabilities in the context of a system where there's historical and contemporary trauma, racism, stigma, shame, poverty, and a lack of timely, accessible, and culturally attuned opportunities to heal and be whole. So while the recent heart-wrenching discoveries in Kamloops and Saskatchewan, and most recently in Penelakut, and the tragic death of Skye might seem on the surface to be unrelated, they are in fact different chapters of the same continuing saga, that of colonialism and the devastating damage it has done and continues to do to First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and urban Indigenous children, families, and communities across Canada. So the children in Kamloops and Saskatchewan and on the island were separated from their parents, siblings, extended families, territories, and cultures as a result of the residential school system, where it ripped them from their homes and incarcerated them in what we have come to know as abusive and dangerous facilities. Skye wasn't born until 2000, a few years after the last residential school closed its doors, but she too experienced the same disconnection and removal from family. And in many ways, we are recognizing now the child welfare system is a modern day residential school. So I'm going to pause there to see if there are any questions that are popping up. Jeff or team?
Jennifer, Laura Blasey has a question. She's raised her hand, so Carissa will unmute her and so she can ask her question. But just before that happens, I'd like to just remind everybody that you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to put your questions in writing, or if you raise your hand, we'll try our best to unmute you and you can ask your question vocally. So, Laura, are you able to speak?
Sorry about that. I think I accidentally pushed that button, so I didn't have an question. I apologize, but this is very important information Dr. Charles were. So sorry about that. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's
Hey,
fine.
no, we figured out it works. This is
Yeah,
awesome.
So
Thanks for helping us.
yeah,
No
thank you.
worries.
So again, like I see no questions in the Q&A right now, but as Jennifer goes forward, please type out any questions you have in the Q&A function and we can read them out, or simply raise your hand and we'll accommodate you that way. So just keep that in mind if you have anything you'd like to bring up.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Okay, so we've introduced you to Skye. We've set out the context. Let's talk about what we learned. So our investigation showed that both Skye and her mom faced tremendous challenges in their lives. And Skye's mother was removed from her family home as an infant and adopted to a non-Indigenous family during the period known as the 60s scoop. And Skye herself was removed from her mother's care when she was 5 years old and actually never saw her again, despite multiple attempts by the mom to reach out and connect, and much desire on the part of Skye. So during her time in care, Skye endured 3 failed adoption plans. She lived in 8 different foster homes, actually, and moved 15 times, or 7 different foster placements between Campbell River and Nanaimo. And she actually moved in a number of other communities on the island as well. She was moved 15 times and she attended 8 different schools, and 4 between a very tight period of time between 2013 and 2015 before she really fundamentally disengaged from schools not meeting her needs. Our report was not, and I should also just say that when we talk about the adoption efforts, I want to put that in the context that our office, in fact, had put a lot of focus on adoptions and creating for other families. And in fact, there was a report to that end. And as a consequence, or in relation to that, MCFD's focus at the time was on legal permanency or adoption. And so we recognize that we have a hand in this as well as an office. And of course, we are all learning what adoption means, and particularly within an Indigenous context. So we're recognizing and continue to recognize that we are all evolving and learning and understanding, but the more kind of intentionality and thought we can bring to that, the better, and to learn from what has happened in the past. Our report was not about blaming individual social workers for what happened to Skye. I feel very strongly, and it's been a key point of mine since the beginning of my tenure, that we are not looking for individual social workers or leaders to blame, because we're all working within a system and we're all complicit in that system, and systems drive our behavior in many cases. So no one person, decision, or event caused the poor life outcomes for Skye and her mom. Instead, it was the cumulative impact driven by misplaced priorities of the system and ingrained attitudes, particularly towards parents who use substances. So again, an area that we've seen some changes, but we have to continue the work in that. For example, early on in her involvement with MCFD, Skye's mom asked the ministry for support to be able to bring Skye with her to a substance use treatment program. And the request was denied, and their mother-daughter relationship was generally discouraged, in fact, rather than encouraged as the years went on. And as we know, those of us who are practitioners, we know that there are some situations in which children are not able to live with their biological parents, and sometimes even with extended family, but there can still be ways of sustaining connections. So that was important to us. Skye was also really clear about what was important to her, but her voice was often not heard. Skye's mother desperately wanted to be a part of her daughter's life, but wasn't supported to actually make that happen. And there were many different instances that we describe in the report. And my hope is that in telling those stories, again, this is not about shaming or blaming. It's about saying, what do we know now that helps us understand how, or what can we learn from this that helps us understand what we can do now to make different kinds of decisions that will support those connections and those vitally important relationships. Another thing that's important is that Skye and her mom experienced abuse during their childhoods. They experienced mental health and substance use challenges, and both could have had much better lives. They might have had much better lives if they'd had a lasting relationship with one another, and they might have had different fates had they been better supported to deal with those past traumas. So some of the Skye's experiences in terms of lack of connection, the lack of continuity of relationships in her life, the multiple social workers and counselors that she interacted with really created a picture of fragmentation. But this is also an intergenerational story, because Skye's grandmother was impacted by government policies and day schools of the time. Her mom was taken from her grandmother at birth because at the time, as her grandmother stated, or as the community stated, you know, the opportunity to raise, for a single mom to raise their child, especially an Indigenous child, was taken from them. And Skye's mom was adopted into a non-Indigenous home and experienced considerable abuse while in the home, and from people known to her. And, you know, the mental health and substance use issues that we're dealing with and the coping mechanisms. So the other thing that's interesting about this is that Skye's sister, her older sister, was adopted with consent from mom to a family friend. And this factored large in, because the intention was for Skye to be able to also be adopted by the friend and have an ongoing relationship with her sister, but that was not to be. That was the first of the failed adoptions. So, as I say, there were many people who cared about Skye and who wanted the best for her. However, what we found was that despite that, and despite some exceptional practice by individual workers, particularly towards the end, it just simply wasn't enough. And it reminds us to take a look at, we might be working in isolation, but what are some of the other connections that need to be made so that we understand the whole? And what is it that the system can do to support those who are trying very hard to practice in a way that supports connection and belonging. So I'm just going to pause now. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of what was revealed in terms of her journey through the system. And then I'll talk about what the big takeaways for us. So any questions that are coming up? I see Brenda.
Yes, Jennifer, we have two questions here, and
Okay.
I can answer the first one. The first one's from Brenda Wagman, and it says, will it be possible for people who could not attend this webinar today to be able to see it? Thank you. Definitely, we're recording this webinar and we will have it put on our YouTube channel. We can send a link out to the same list that we sent these invitations to, and we'll also put a link on our social media so that you can spread that around to other people who may have wanted to take part in this today and weren't able to. And Jennifer, the second question is for you, from Lisa Martin. She's wondering, I'll just paraphrase the two questions she's asked, but basically she says, I'm wondering why a death from 2017 was recently investigated and the relevance referring to the timing of a death in 2017, its relevance now.
Yeah. It's a great question, Lisa. Thank you. It's a question we ask ourselves actually when we're choosing whether we are going to investigate, go into a fuller investigation, because frankly, investigations take time, a couple of years typically after a death, before we've completed an investigation. But here's the thing with Skye's story, and just to give you a sense, we'll have a reportable that will come into us. The team will review that. They'll bring that forward to the executive and myself, and we'll consider, so what do we need to do with this situation? You know, like there are 240 a month that come to us, and we take a look at all of them that are in mandate, and a whole bunch that aren't in mandate that we also take a look at. And then we'll do a comprehensive review to see, is there something here? This is a file review, very comprehensive file review. And then that kind of helps us discern again, is this a story that needs to be told? And the reason we chose Skye's story, even though, as you rightly point out, she passed almost 4 years ago now in August, is that we continue to see the same kinds of things surfacing every month in our reviews and in our advocacy situations. So her story is actually a timeless story, which is why we talk about Skye's legacy. So we felt that because the issues are still present and we're dealing with them, despite the fact that there is a lot of change in practice, we felt that it was an important story to tell. So we all, you raise a good point. It's like, so at what point is it kind of a story that's an old story? And this was not one of those. It was an old story. It's still a contemporary story, even though it's a number of years out. And I can see another question, is Skye's mom still alive? And if so, has she been involved in this report? And yeah, with how she wants Skye to be remembered. So sadly, Skye's mom passed away before Skye did. I can't remember, Caitlin, you can fill me in. It was less than a year before Skye passed away. So, but you raise a really important point, Mia, that how do we tell the story in a good way? So there are other family members that were part of this investigation. They were very clear about how they wanted Skye's story to be remembered. And in fact, they were the ones that said that they wanted Skye's name used. Oftentimes we use a pseudonym. And her nation, although she never had the opportunity to go and visit her nation, her chief was very involved. Elders and advisors within her community were involved. And it's through them and through the family members that, and including some of her adoptive family members as well, or her mother's adoptive family members, all of them were engaged and had the opportunity to see a report before we released it. And we always provide them with the opportunity to provide us with advice and guidance. So this is based on those who are living. This is how they wanted Skye's story to be told. And Richard, how far along were the attempted adoptions? How old was she at each attempted placement? And were these adoption breakdowns or proposed placements that did not go ahead? Oh boy, lots of questions there. So the adoptions were in various states. Each one was in a various state that's detailed in the report. We can steer you in that direction a little bit more clearly. And Caitlin, you may wish to type in something as well or speak to that. So the first adoption placement was when, or the adoption plan, that's why we use the term plan. The first adoption plan was for her to join her sister, and that's what she knew her mom wanted, and that's what she had been told was going to happen, and she was looking forward to that. And there were a number of delays in the home studies that were being done because the prospective adoptive family was living in Alberta. And there were a number of delays, and ultimately a decision was made that that was not going to go ahead. And that was devastating for Skye. So that was the first one. The next one, it happened quite rapidly, and she was placed with a family, and in a very short space of time, so they were in their placement period. In a very short space of time, a number of people started to have concerns about the appropriateness of that placement. And it ultimately broke down. And Caitlin, you may want to be unmuted because you'll probably have some more fastidious remembrance of the details. But that broke down because it was simply an unsuitable placement, and the adoptive family, as we talk about in the report, really was unable to see the strengths in Skye. And so it was going from bad to worse. So that was, they never went back into court to confirm that placement. It broke down before the first 6 months. The final one was, again, done very rapidly. Very little transition, very experienced foster caregivers and adoptive family. And they say in retrospect that they knew better, that it was a very rapid transition and it was not done well. In fact, they described it as the worst experience that they had had. And unrelated to Skye, the family experienced tragedy with several of their other children. So they were just hanging on by their fingernails and really in a tremendous amount of turmoil. And sadly, once again, the kinds of supports and the wraparounds for that family were not done in such a way that Skye's placement there could be successful. So that also broke down all before the time she was 12. So hopefully that answers that question.
Jennifer, did you want me to add in?
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. I was just wondering if I can't see you, so please go ahead to add to that for Richard.
Yeah, thank you. I was just sitting here wanting to make sure that I wasn't going to interrupt anything. But yeah, just to go back and give some context about the question about Skye's mother is, yeah, she passed away 9 months before Skye did in 2016. And then in terms of the adoption plans, the delays with the adoptions assessment because of the interprovincial protocols and issues definitely became part of the reason why that assessment wasn't able to go through with her half-sister. And the unfortunate thing is that Skye was really, really built up and expecting this to happen, that it was like a surefire thing. She put all her eggs in that basket and she was so excited and so ready to go with her sister. But unfortunately, when that fell through, it really affected her placement with her foster caregiver that she had been with for a number of years. So there was definitely some indication within the materials that we reviewed that the move to a new adoptive family was pressured by the fact that her foster parent was also struggling with the fact that Skye was dealing with this, rejection and disappointment of not being able to move with her half-sister. So when we see the rush to that first adoptive placement where she's moved out of the foster home, we speak to the fact that there was also the process of needing to get the Aboriginal Exceptions Committee to approve the cultural plan of care for Skye and how important that was. And it wasn't robust enough at the time to get an approval. So a decision was made to place her as a restricted foster placement anyway. So it wasn't yet an adoptions placement. So she was placed as another foster placement for a period of time until they could get the approval from the Aboriginal Exceptions Committee. At which point it did turn into an official adoptions placement to start that residency period. So that the adoptions period itself really was only, I think, 2 to 3 months. And she was in that placement with those caregivers for, I think, about 7 months total. And yeah, a lot of the issues were that, they could have been a really great placement for them, but it's almost as though a family was identified and they wanted so badly to make it work so quickly, but Skye's needs weren't being met and the family wasn't able to emotionally meet her where she was at. Mm-hmm. And so that didn't pan out. And then she was placed in a really lovely foster home with an Indigenous caregiver for many years, but they were once again faced with the fact that a foster placement could not be considered permanency because it is a contracted resource by MCFD, and they wanted to see her with that long-term permanent plan under the courts. And so when adoption came up again, it moved quite quickly because once again they identified a family and wanted to make it work as quickly as possible so that they wouldn't lose the placement. Mm-hmm. So I think that adds a little bit of context to some of the hastiness with those placements.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Caitlin. That's really helpful. And again, it in good intentions, and 2020 hindsight's always a helpful thing. However, one of the things when we see this over and over again, when placements are done without appropriate transitions, or in the situation where Skye had a very committed Indigenous foster family that was very committed to being an ongoing family for her, that wasn't seen as good enough. So yeah, it's just very interesting. That's why we've come back to that sense of belonging and having more of an expansive view of connection and belonging. So let me answer a couple of other things. How involved was the nation and extended family in the adoption plan? It's a great question, Sam. So interestingly, the nation, the required notifications were made, but interestingly, the nation themselves said that they didn't want Skye to be moved from the foster family that they were with, nor did the surviving the adopted grandparents, because they felt that she was stable and she was getting what she needed. So the nation actually asked at one point for the ministry not to proceed with the adoptions because they wanted to do more work to see if there were familial connections within their community, if there were other things that they could do to provide support. So they asked the ministry to hold off on that, but that was not done. So that's an important piece. So included, but not necessarily heeded or heard. So another question here, when I attended UBC School of Social Work in the 90s, we were given an assignment to conduct a review into the Royal Commission conduct a Royal Commission into Indigenous child welfare history and practice in BC. Oh, so you were actually given an assignment to do the Royal Commission, not review. I learned a considerable amount from this assignment that has stayed with me in my practice ever since. I wonder if it would be helpful moving forward if all social workers in the field were required to be trained and registered social worker with the College of Social Work. So you're opening up a really interesting area of consideration that we have is how best for anyone that's working with young people, how best to ensure that they are have the awareness, the understanding, the kind of knowledge, the empathy, understanding, and humility that's necessary in order to be able to situate their work with, particularly with Indigenous children, youth, and families in the context of history and in the context of the contemporary impacts of that history on child and youth well-being. So it's a great question. I think it's absolutely critical that we do a better job, all of us, in making sure that we have much deeper knowledge and understanding, and we're constantly learning as we go because so much is being revealed, so many stories are coming to light. Horrific stories as well as stories of tremendous resilience and strength that are also part of it, so that we can combat some of the implicit or unconscious bias that we carry. I've been in the field for 43 years, and the first 20 years of my practice in child welfare and in frontline child and youth care services, there was really no discussion, no awareness or understanding of the experience of what has happened to Indigenous children and youth and how that plays out. So I think that it's a really important point that's being raised. Moving on, was the paternal family involved or explored? The paternal family, correct me if I am wrong, Caitlin, but the paternal family was not known, or the paternal and I believe the father died before, the biological father died before Skye's birth. But Caitlin, I can see, is typing an answer, so you will get that. So from Lisa again, thank you. You described the child welfare system as a kind of continuation of the residential school system. Yes, modern day residential school system is how it's often described. I'm curious what changes you think need to happen so our system doesn't continue to make the same mistakes that were made in the past. Beautiful question, and it's one that I hope that as we come to, as we're participating in this conversation today, that we're all asking ourselves, so what is it that we're seeing that in our current system that's replicating these kinds of things? I think one of the things that's particularly important for us is to really embrace and understand the federal act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children and families. I think that's critically important, and be paying close attention to the ways in which nations and communities are starting to reclaim and to recover their traditional practices, their rules, their laws, their decision-making processes, etc. And I think one of the things that's important for us in terms of not replicating is this whole piece on belonging. And so I'll move into that in a moment, and hopefully that will help to answer that question. Because if we start to think about what we're trying to raise our children, all of our children up to experience, then it means that we are going to ask questions of our own practice and push our system to be more accountable. For example, if we really privilege and we, not privilege over others, but if we really privilege that sense of belonging to culture, belonging to place, a sense of community, a sense of continuity in the relationships and having multiple meaningful relationships, then we might be in a situation where we have fewer children brought into care, because we're starting to get creative in figuring out how we wrap around the child and those families so that the family, be it the biological family, the biological parents or their extended family or their community family, is able to raise those children up in a good way with support. So did Skye have any involvement with youth justice? No, she did not. At this time, we did not review any youth justice. She was not, but Caitlin, you can certainly, if I've missed something that we didn't share in the report, then you can speak into that. And you mentioned that Skye disengaged in school as the schools she'd attended did not meet her needs. From your investigation, did you find any information of whether schools recognized Skye's disengagement? Oh, yes. So one of the schools, so this is an interesting piece. When we start to think of belonging and connection, it's very hard, and we see this over and over again, when children are being, because their foster placements change or they're moving back and forth between care or returns homes or supervision orders or whatever, they will often experience disconnection from school because they're moving between schools, often in the middle of the school year. They're moving completely different communities. And it makes it, can you we just reflect on our own experience when we change schools, that it can be very destabilizing. But if you imagine that happening over and over again, school doesn't necessarily become a place of positive experience because you're constantly having to adjust and adapt and figure out what's the new context is requiring you to do, and who are your friends going to be and whatnot. So we often see young people just saying, not for me, that's just one more complication in my life. I'm going to disengage from school. So I wouldn't say that we found necessarily that the schools were not trying to attend to her needs, but basically she was either there for a very short space of time, or they didn't fully understand what was going on for her. So they didn't have a way of wrapping around her in a good way. There was one school, Siwak in Nanaimo, run by the Nanaimo Aboriginal Center at the time, that as we included that, I shared a little bit about Siwak, but they tried hard, but by then Skye's experience of school was sufficiently unhelpful that she didn't participate as fully as she might. So I would say they recognized her disengagement, but at that point, they weren't really in a position to kind of bring her back in a good way. So education, we've had lots of conversations on this and other matters with respect to education. One of the things they're hampered by, have been hampered by, is that oftentimes schools don't even know a young person is in care. So protocols have been established, agreements have been struck. So now there is better communication and information sharing. But in Skye's lifetime, that was not the case. Oftentimes, schools just simply wouldn't be aware of what was going on for her and her family life. So looks like we've answered that. So let me move on. Okay, importance of belonging. So Dr. Martin Brokenleg, Circle of Courage fame, he was on our circle of advisors, and he talks about belonging as the most necessary human experience. It's in every child. The need to belong is in every child. And what we were taking a look at when we were doing this work is, of course, the domains of permanency, we're familiar with those, we've often heard about legal permanency and adoption, cultural permanency, or relational permanency, and physical permanency, connection to place. So those are well known within our sector, but we decided that we wanted to be a bit disruptive in this, and two areas. One was that we wanted to talk about the notion of belonging, because permanency, we've just kind of become immune to that and what that really means. But belonging is something that we can all connect to, I think, because we have places of belonging ourselves, belonging in our families and in our communities with friends, a sense of place, belonging in the physical world. So we thought, well, that resonates with all of us. And we also wanted to introduce this notion of identity, that without a good, strong sense of belonging in multiple places, then it's hard for us to construct, or any child to construct, a sense of their identity, their sense of the future, the sense of hopefulness and promise in their lives, who they are and what they stand for. So we went in that direction, and unfortunately, what we see all too often is the child serving system leading to what Dr. Martin Brokenleg refers to as unbelonging. And unfortunately, as you've heard, Skye endured those 3 failed adoption plans. She lived in 8 different homes. She moved 15 times. She attended 8 different schools. And as I've said before, it really disrupted all those opportunities for belonging. So we felt it was important that every human needs deep connections and to feel a sense of belonging. So that's what we thought this unique story could teach us. So language is important, and we realized that we wanted to disrupt our own language and invite ourselves within the RCY to think differently about it. And we also wanted to, when we bring that notion of belonging, it connotes connection, it connotes attachment, and we know that that's important for child and youth brain development, and how important that is in order to have a sense of wholeness in our lives. One of the things we found was that there was a hierarchy. There's typically been a hierarchy in these domains of permanency, or those domains of belonging, with legal being the most important. It's like create that forever family. So we felt it was important to talk about that. So our overarching finding was that the narrow focus on adoption, or forever family, legal permanency, came at the expense of the other aspects of her belonging. So other findings that we had were her family relationships were not sufficiently prioritized, encouraged, or supported, indeed. Her need, desire, and right to connect with her First Nations culture, traditions, and practices weren't consistently supported. There are some beautiful stories of her and her foster parents sitting down and researching her home community and what it would take to get up there, and more about who her family was and what the background to her people was and what was important to them, what their values were. So she was doing that research herself, but it wasn't supported consistently. There was a roots worker, but things got lost. We don't even know if she was, if anybody took the time to spend with her to go through what was discovered through the roots work. So the next finding was, after she came into continuing care, her connection and belonging to her physical environment, the lands that she was on, her community school and her home, were repeatedly disrupted. She was moved around a lot. So that sense of belonging to the land and the place, and this was a young person that was very connected to nature. So the land was important to her. Community was important. She had friends, and she had a sense of connection to certain places. So that was disrupted. And the final one was as a result of that lack of connection with family members and important people in her life, including the foster caregivers who had loved her, and some of the meaningful relationships she had with counselors. and the lack of a permanent physical home and the lack of connection to her culture, she was never able to establish that sense of her own identity in a healthy way. She had other senses of herself that were not positive and hopeful. So those were some of our findings, and the cumulative result was that we felt that fundamentally the system had failed Skye. So let's just pause there. I'm mindful of time. I'm going to take a look at the question. Hello, Emily. Nice to see your name here. I'm wondering why the First Nations foster family could not have been a permanency option for Skye. Did it have anything to do with the policy running there needed to be a safe home study completed for permanency when a child is in care by CCO? So interesting. This was an interesting discovery for us. So the foster family was basically given what they experienced as an ultimatum, you know, make a decision in 2 months whether you're going to adopt Skye or we're going to move on and we're going to place her. And so the family felt that that was not culturally appropriate, that and I think their words, and feel free to type in other things or speak in, Caitlin, the family felt that adoption was a whole family decision, including with Skye, not something that should be done by demand, if you will. So they had some very strong feelings about this. And ultimately they felt that on a matter, I think they felt that while they were very committed to Skye as being her family, they felt that they could not proceed at that point with adoption for a variety of reasons. So it was at that point that the ministry said, well, then we're going to move Skye out of your home. And sadly, I think one of the heartbreaking things for me in reading this story or in reviewing the findings from this story was that thereafter, they were forbidden to have any connection with Skye, and the new placement that Skye went to was told to not have any contact. So as you can imagine, in a 2-week period of time, Skye went from feeling that these are my people, I've known, you know, my family, my mom knew these folks, I've known them, and feeling as stable as she could, given all the trauma that she'd experienced. There was a 2-week transition. She didn't have an opportunity to say goodbye to her foster father. And then they were forbidden to have any kind of further contact. So that was a very critical and heartbreaking thing. And I do have to say that one of the things I would hope for as we go forward and we learn from this is, what are the attitudes and the ways in which we work with foster families as well? Because they have tremendous insights about children. And it's been my experience, having also worked in guardianship and resources, that sometimes we don't demonstrate as much respect, and particularly if the foster family is challenging and the caregiver is challenging some of our views and opinions. So there's a whole variety of reasons for that, but how might we be listening and learning? So carry on. So hopefully that's helpful, Emily. Was there consideration to including the report the context within which many social workers practice, that of extremely high caseloads, workload, and chronic staff shortages? Most, if not all, social workers would wish to focus more on the important work this report focuses on, but their workload is high that it's not possible. Thank you for that, Sonia. We definitely did consider that. We've spoken a great deal about the social workers, guardianship workers, you know, throughout the system. In fact, the caseloads and the challenges that leads to results where there is a lack of opportunity to do the work that many staff wish to do. Staff shortages, particularly in certain areas of the province, North Island being one of them, where she was being served. So we did contemplate that. We decided that we have spoken about that in other reports, and it was not necessarily a situation where we saw that coming out really clearly in this story. It was really a matter, what was most significant about the workers' experience, and this was the constant turnover of staff. So staff not even having an opportunity to get to know Skye or her story, or even questioning assumptions and things that were on the file, didn't have the opportunity to go and have more curiosity about that. So I hope that answers. How does one help repair the disconnection to Indigenous nations so that they feel empowered to have their children returned? Oh my goodness. Whoever anonymous attendees are, you're asking some great questions here, maybe multiple people. But I think that's one of the things that we need to pay attention to. How do we repair that disconnection? And I think there are some nations that have been forging ahead and really see themselves as being empowered and recovering or revitalizing the things that they have always known. But this is not going to be easy. We're in for a very, I would say, a very exciting but also challenging time as we try and navigate the many different range of ways in which we move forward, particularly in support of Indigenous children. So I don't have the answer to that one. I wish I did, but I think that's why we, recommendation 3 was really about us beginning to come together to talk about, so what could we do to foster belonging? What is it that we need to take a look at in terms of our practice? And what are the systems barriers that are getting in the way for us to be able to do that? Okay, moving quickly along. You discussed the legal aspects of permanency as getting in the way of belonging. I see a link with this and the idea you presented at the beginning of being complicit in the system. What are your thoughts of legalities getting in the way of client-centered care? I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I don't, yeah, so you might want to just ask that a little bit different. What are the thoughts of legalities getting in the way of client-centered care? I think that if I think of legislation, and I don't know if I'm answering the question, but we actually have a lot of kind of infrastructure, policies, guidelines, legislation that would enable us to do some good client-centered care. But I think that there are attitudes, beliefs, assumptions, and as the previous person was talking about too, the challenges in terms of our capacity to do client-centered care, whether that's because we have significant staff shortages, high turnover, or difficulties in the opportunity that we have to spend time with young people. So I think it's actually less about our legislation, to be honest, especially now that we've got the federal legislation and the things that we can learn from that, and more about what's the system, how is the system enabling us to do the client-centered care? Hope that answers. Yvonne, hello. Nice to have you on. Given the history of the child welfare system, we know there are many children in care who've been in long-term care and connections have not been supported, or caregivers struggle to support those connections. Absolutely. We know it's so important to make those connections, even if it's later in placement. Sadly, in some of these situations, the children do not want these connections. Right. What is RCY's recommendations in situations where children and youth are refusing to see family and get involved in their culture? Oh my goodness. This is, yeah, this happens a tremendous amount where we hear from young people themselves are saying, no, I don't want to have, this is my community. I don't want to have anything to do with my community, or I've heard things that, or I have memories and I'm afraid to have connection with the community. So there's lots of different reasons that young people might not want to have connection with family or culture. So one of the things that I think, and you'll have tremendous expertise in this, in the roles that you've played, Yvonne, and there are many people in this circle, I'm sure, that do. But how is it that we stay connected to that young person and not just take on the surface, you know, I don't want to have any connection. Oh, okay. But understand and unpack. So what's that about? You know, it's quite different if it's about fears because they have memories and trauma, as compared to, I'm afraid I'm going to make a mistake, or I don't know what to do, or I don't know what it feels like to be Indigenous. There's a whole wide range of reasons that young people wouldn't be wanting to connect with family or community. So it's our responsibility as an ally to that young person in their growth and development, especially if we embrace the whole notion of belonging, is to understand why, to help them understand how, for example, they might be able to feel safe, or what would it take for you to feel safe while also having some exploration. Or here's some other family members. Do you have some memories of family members that you felt really safe with? As an example, if it's a safety or fear issue. But really beginning to unpack and be constantly present for that curiosity to emerge and to begin to sow those seeds of curiosity. Okay, maybe you don't want, but how about if we learn a little bit more? Much as Skye did for herself, I want to learn a little bit more about my community. So I think it requires us to slow down. If we embrace that notion of belonging to culture, community, and sense of place, the land, the people, etc., then what are those little opportunities where we can sow seeds? But as I say, there's lots of wisdom that you have. I think that it's important that we listen to young people and what's going on, not dismiss those concerns, because there's a reason for them. All behavior, all that children tell us, there's a reason for it. Okay, former CCO from the 60s, Scoop. And you didn't know your Indigenous nation. Thank you, Cecile, for being here today. Yeah, and there's so many stories that I hear of people later in life learning or discovering, and I think, and then reconnecting in very powerful and ways. And the connections between knowledge keepers or people that have walked those journey can be really important for young people as well. How to improve connections for belonging for kids on my caseload. Thank you, Cecile. Why don't we just, I'm just mindful of time here. How about we just move into...
Jennifer, if I could just interject for a second. We have a question, a vocal or audio question from E.A. Walker. Sorry, I don't have a first name, just those initials. And I believe Chris has unmuted her. So could she ask her question, or he ask his question?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, good afternoon. It's more of a comment. I just wanted to move back to your, when you were having questions around the adoption piece. And, I'm only bringing this up because I think it's still an issue. I've been a practitioner for 35 years plus, and still counting. But I think if I was sort of looking back on past practice, current practice, and the challenges in between, I think when I started, we really left kids in care. We took our caregivers' word that they, because they would perhaps communicate that they were making a permanent commitment to the kids, didn't feel like they could adopt them or provide a legal permanency, let's say. And then we often found ourselves, and that worked when the kids were young, but we often found ourselves with youth then where the caregivers said, we can't do this anymore. And so it resulted in the child moving. And as we know, anyone who's been in child welfare for any period of time, that when you start moving youth, they tend to move a lot because you just don't have, for a variety of reasons, which I'm sure most people probably already know, so I won't say. But I'd say, we're still there because I think we lose trust in our caregivers sometimes about really what is the level of their commitment to our children, right? Mm-hmm. And if they're not prepared to make that legal commitment, can we trust that they're going to stick it through with them thick and thin, and not only till they end their time in care, but also be there for them subsequent to that period of time, right? And so the pressure to find that lifelong connection, I guess you could say, for our kids. And I think that continues to be a challenge and a struggle for us, even though we recognize that there's multiple dimensions to permanency, in a way we didn't in the past. And and then this whole idea of belonging, because so often we get people competing. As you know, many children in care that come in care with siblings end up not being raised with their siblings because we don't have families that are able to take, especially with a larger sibling group, on. And so then we get multiple competitors who claim the children. And, you know, and we might be focusing on the most important relationship, if they can't be raised with their parents, is with each other. But then you have adults saying, no, it's with me. And you know, like it's, and I there's no simple solution. But I just wanted to provide that context as well in this discussion, because there's so many levels that we have to look at when we're trying to provide a committed family, you know, lifelong family, I guess is the word I'm going to use, for the kids in our care.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate what you're saying there, because it's, and thank you for working in the field for a long time, because that it is important to know where we've come from and where we're going to. But I think there are a couple of things that really, we do see quite a pattern in our reviews work where 11, 12, 13 is such a critical time, and you see situations, and as you say, you know, placements break down, and then it's like 5 placements in the next year. And that is incredibly difficult. So if we, again, take the lens of belonging, so all of that disruption creates just huge, huge challenges for that young person. And then increasingly you see them disengaging from, in fact, we often talk about how important it is for us to even shift our language rather than say, oh, the young person's disengaged. It's like we have created the conditions in which they're disengaging. So I think you're absolutely right. We've really got to take a look at how do we create those lifelong connections for young people. And the other thing we often see is that foster caregivers or adoptive family placements or extended family placements are often, particularly with the out of care options and extended family placements, we see situations in which they'll be saying, we're struggling, we need some help here. It's like, well, you know, if there just isn't the kind of help and support that's needed, and then there's a crisis point, and then things fall apart and it's catastrophic. So I think that really speaks to those ways in which we recognize that we might need to continue to support a family or a caregiver or an extended family member a lot in order for them to sustain those connections, particularly through those really tricky teen years when a lot of families just say, nope, I'm not going to do it. The other thing, I'm rambling a little bit here, but the other thing is we know that kids often go back to their families after they've aged into adulthood. So doesn't that teach us something too, where we should make sure that we're doing whatever we can to create those connections, meaningful connections, even if they can't live with their family or community on a full-time basis. So, but thank you for your comments. These are exactly the kinds of reflections and curiosity that I hope our recommendation 3 will surface as we go forward, because it's highly complex. There's no way I can write a recommendation that would fix this.
Jennifer, if I could just interject, we have a few more questions in the chat, but
okay,
as you suggested earlier, do you want to just go on, finish your presentation, and we'll answer?
Sure, why don't I do that? So basically, we're just at the recommendations, just so that you know where we were going. And as I've said before, there's some really positive movement with the Federal Act, with changes to the Child Family Community Services Act, with a number of things that are going on, and it's not going to be easy, and it's going to take a while. So what we tried to do was figure out what could our recommendations do that would help move this along and really keep the focus on belonging. So I just made 3 recommendations, but they're not light or simple. So the first was, we felt it was important that there be more cultural and family support resources and investments in that. So we've asked for a systematic review be undertaken to ensure that workers, because we've heard through other work that we're doing, at least half of the workers in the ministry say that they don't have access to enough of those supports to ensure that those cultural connections, to do the family finding, to do the roots work, etc. So we said an immediate investment and a systemic review to see what else would be necessary in order to ensure that that was robust. Next one was to shift, pardon me, our language from permanency to belonging, and to begin to use that over and over again as a way to shift our perspectives, our attitudes, and our ways of thinking about things. Pardon me. And then the third one, which is a process one, is meaningfully engage staff using the Aboriginal Policy and Practice Framework and the circle practices inherent in that to review Skye's story. So all staff that are working with young people, with the intention of bringing some curiosity, some humility, and some reflection. What can we do to enhance belonging? And you might be curious about this last one because it's so process-based, and like, how will we measure accountability and change anyway? And some people were disappointed that we weren't more specific or kind of speaking to policies or legislation or whatever. And we certainly considered that. But one of the things that we felt is that we actually, legislation and regulation doesn't necessarily change practice. People change practice. And we have, with our work and our connections out there, we know that the vast majority of practitioners are wanting to do good work. So we felt, how do we create a space and work with the ministry and encourage the ministry and others to begin to think differently and see ways in which we can enhance the practice of belonging. And then through that, it will reveal those things within the systems that others have spoken about that are getting in the way of that, whether it is lack of resources to support cultural connection or high staff turnover and workloads that are requiring workers that are preventing workers from doing the work that they think is necessary. So as I said, I'm an ex-frontline worker, worked in many different ways in the field, and I know that the vast majority of us want the best for children. So what is it that we can do within our spheres of influence? How can we support one another? How can we work with community in a meaningful way? How can we embrace these new opportunities that are presenting to us? And where is the system getting in the way, and how can we affect that kind of systemic change? So that's what our hope was in sharing this story. And the thing is that the ministry has been very receptive to the recommendations and the learning. And I think they've been moved by Skye's story. Many people are being moved by Skye's story. So when we enter into this work with that sense of humility and curiosity, I think that we can do great things. So I will stop there and let's see if we've got some other questions.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, we've got 3 questions here, Jennifer. I don't know if you want me to read them to you or if you want to read them out.
I've got them in front of me, so I will I'll stop sharing. There we go. I'm wondering if any work was done to mitigate concerns about Skye's half-sister's home. Was concerns for that home addressed by Child Protection in Alberta in regards to the half-sister? Such a great question. One of the things we've done is we released a report on Interprovincial, caught in the middle, year and a half ago. Time's blurring, but and at that point we talked about the interprovincial issues, poor communication, lack of follow through on things, and I would say that there were concerns that the team revealed around the practice, the interprovincial work that was being done. Took a long time, for example, to get a home study done. And what was really curious to us is that there was no kind of curiosity or investigation or consideration of what could be done to address the concerns that were raised about the home in Alberta, to enable that, or even a candid conversation. We didn't see any evidence that a candid conversation was held by the prospective adoptive mom about what would need to happen in order for her to welcome Skye. So yes, to answer your question, interprovincial remains a concern for us. And this reveals the importance of being able to say, okay, well, maybe it's not perfect, that's for sure. So what would we need to do in order to make sure that this would be a good and safe place and that you feel well supported caring for Skye as well as her sister? So in regards to how do you connect with the nations, you hire cultural continuity workers to facilitate that work. Hence recommendation number 1. So thank you for that. We need to make sure that we've got those resources and that it's happening right at the beginning. Yvonne asked that question of children that are in care for many years. And of course, we're going to be dealing with that and trying to figure out how to support those children, given that they didn't have the opportunities early on. But for any child coming into care now, having those very immediate kind of responses. Where's the family connections? Who's out there? How do we ensure there's some cultural continuity, even if that young person can't live with extended family members? So that's why recommendation 1. Is there work being done to help get more Indigenous people as foster parents? The ministries, and you have to ask the ministry folks there. My understanding, and I've seen over many years, there's been many, many attempts. But one of the things that was revealed to us through this is that there are a number of systemic barriers for First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and Urban Indigenous folks to become foster caregivers because of prior contacts and whatnot. And that when you think about it, why would they trust the ministry? Why would they trust this kind of a process? So there are many that feel that the ministry isn't a place for them, or even DAAs for that matter, where people think, I don't know that those are the kinds of ways in which I want to support children and youth. So it's not just a matter of a recruitment campaign is what's been learned. It's really, so what are the attitudes, the beliefs, the ways in which foster caregivers are treated, and how is it that we disrupt some of those colonial practices so that it means that it's more viable, and it seems like a good proposition for people to actually be connected, rather than one that they would feel like their integrity would be compromised, if that makes some sense. What are your thoughts on FNLC and other organizations' responses to RCY recommendations, referencing C92 federal legislation and support to the continued recovery of child to bring them home from care, dismantling the child welfare process, as you earlier stated, as an extension of residential schools? So we work very, very closely with the FNLC and Métis Nation BC, for that matter, and other groups like BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centers, Delegated Aboriginal Agency Directors. So typically the FNLC, there's never a surprise for people in terms of the work that we're doing on our reports, our recommendations, the directions that we're going. So there's also often opportunities for us to have really important conversations with those folks around what they think of our reviews and our recommendations. And by and large, we've enjoyed tremendous support from them. And of course, they are saying, always situate this work towards where we're going with the federal legislation. One of the things that in consulting with the FNLC prior to releasing Skye's report is that they have said to us on a number of occasions, look, we are focusing on where we're going and what lies ahead with respect to the federal legislation and what we want for our children and to come home. And right now, you pay attention to the children that are currently in care, and make sure that whatever is happening is in the spirit and the intention of those connections and belonging to culture and community and to family. So I hope that answers your questions. So FNLC continues to teach us a tremendous amount, and we continue to have a good working relationship with them. And sometimes there are challenges, sometimes we disagree on things, but that's to be expected because this work is complex and it's difficult and there's no simple solutions. So we've done those questions, unless you're seeing anything in, oh, there's a few things in the chat. So let's just see what we can pick up in the chat. And Jeff, I might have missed some things, so feel free to jump in. There's a late start at some of these kids' lives for attempts at connection and to culture and community. Absolutely there is, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying, right? Aboriginal Policy and Practice Framework offers some guidance about the circle as a restorative process and includes some intentional questions for personal and professional self-reflection to honor the worldview, values, and foundations from the Indigenous community. Exactly, Judy, thanks for raising that. And that's one of the reasons that we reference the APPF in this and think that the circle practice and the way in which there's an invitation into reflection, into curiosity, and to, helping each other figure out the best ways forward. So we think that there's a lot to recommend with APPF. So, yes.
Jennifer Fira Pierce, if I'm saying her first name correctly, says, I think we need to have a more attachment lens with the families we work with, where we recognize that it has been many generations of colonial harm done, and that we will need to put in the work and supports with many, many families for possibly more than one generation. I hear team leaders telling their staff to figure out how to cut families loose and not to get too dependent on, in quotes, us, which is obviously not working.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for your observation. And I think that point of when there have been many generations and when we can track the history into contemporary times and the fact that the harms are continuing, those colonial harms continue to express themselves in many different ways. And in fact, we're dealing with racism and misunderstanding and stigma and shame and explicit and implicit bias. Of course, we're going to have to put in a lot of work, and it's going to have to be for many families and for generations, and begin to think of the different and more creative ways of working alongside with families and sustaining whatever connections can be held with community where it's also safe. So I hear team leaders telling their staff to figure out how to cut families loose and not get too dependent on us. Yeah, and that's something that's a narrative I can remember from my practice, my frontline practice, as well as, if a family is dependent upon us, then they aren't ready to parent. And I think those are the kinds of assumptions or biases that we need to unpack. That's one of the reasons we did recommendation 3, is that we could just be replicating our biases or our assumptions if we don't take a close look at them. So is dependency, or is the need for having an ongoing relationship with the MCFD or with the service delivery system necessarily a bad thing? As Megan is saying, we're interdependent, we're relational. It does take the oft-used quote, it takes a village to raise a child. Why would we expect a family that is dealing with the legacy of colonization, might be dealing with housing instability and poverty and whatnot, why should we blame them and say, oh, well, we're not going to support you any longer because you should be standing on your own 2 feet? What would it take for us to bring that kind of empathy in and recognize that in the grand scheme of things, if we think long view, providing support to that family right now will benefit the children and that family over the long term and generations to come. So there is a lot about attitudes and beliefs and how it is that we unpack those, even if we aren't particularly mindful of what we're thinking. It's a time for us to, in this time of reckoning and review, of saying, so what might have to look different, and how am I going to show up as a practitioner as well, and how do I hold my system, the systems that I work within and with, accountable for that as well. It's not simple. So I am just seeing now.
Jennifer, I just had something
yes,
to add.
Caitlin, please.
I just really wanted to speak into what Fira, you were saying. I really appreciate you bringing these points up about the kinds of lenses that we need to bring forth to this work. And I came to the investigation with a background in child protection as well, and I worked for many years with the DAA, and certainly I can understand the perspective of we need to not enable these families to continue to depend on us, because then they'll never become independent themselves. But yeah, I think that the context for that, we should really be looking at that traditional Indigenous worldview of, like you said, Jennifer, it takes a village, where communities were responsible for the children, and it's even written into the CFCSA now as of 2019, where it speaks to the community's responsibility to the child, not just the parents who are entitled to custody. But we need to be looking at that whole, how do we enable the community to wrap around the family so that we're able to take that step back? And part of that is the federal legislation, and really helping those communities to successfully reclaim their jurisdiction over their child welfare delivery. But then also for urban Indigenous children and youth, how do we also then build those communities to be stronger, so that there is less dependence on the crisis-based interventions that we are so often providing, rather than those preventative wraparound spaces of belonging and safety.
Yeah, excellent, thank you. Yes, and we've got to remember that so many of our children are living in urban environments. So we are at 4 o'clock, and I'd like to thank you very much for all the questions and the comments, your attention over this period of time. Our hope is that the conversations will continue. You're welcome to email us through our general mailbox with any further questions or comments that you have. We'll do our best to take a look at that and either weave it into subsequent work that we're going to be doing, or respond to those directly with you. So don't hesitate to send those questions or comments. And as I've said before, our intention is for us to continue these conversations, or to encourage continued conversations on Skye's legacy and what we can learn about how this is going to influence and inform our practice going ahead. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to Caitlin for speaking in, and to Jeff for hosting us. And we will capture these. Yes, so Carissa has just put in the chat how you can reach us, rcy@rcybc.ca. Yes, you're absolutely right. There's, lots of great comments here. So we will save the chat, and we will be able to respond to some of these and begin the dialogue in whatever creative ways we can do using online platforms these days. So thank you very much for joining us. And I just invite you to think about belonging, and how is it that we can support our young people to have that strong sense of connection. Take care, everybody.